All right, we are live. And like always, I'm going to go ahead and get started. People can come in, or you can just catch the replay. So, we're live with Ava. It's our Monday night series for the month of July. July being Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. So, that's why we're kind of doing this to talk about trauma. And I was kind of late to the party, so this is only the second Monday. So I'll at least do one more to kind of wrap up this trauma series. And I know trauma isn't necessarily fun to talk about, but hopefully you'll learn something new that is helpful for you. So before we jump into it, first thing I want to say is thank everyone so much for purchasing my ebook, Valued. It's the exact same book as the paperback that you may have already purchased, but it was just an ebook format. I really appreciate you guys helping me to make it to the number one new release on Amazon in two different categories. I think I made it to number one in counseling children and parent education or something like that. So either way, so no, and I'm still the number one new release in both those areas. So thank y'all. And I know you guys have been asking about the second book as well, and that'll be here soon. But I still need to do some things with this first book. I got some speaking engagements coming up, so and just continuing to talk to you guys and educate you guys as well. Part of the whole campaign was I did promise some Amazon gift cards to people who hashtag valued and posted that they have bought the ebook. And I did a real official. I went through the hashtag, whoever did it correctly, and they did the hashtag and tagged me. I assigned them numbers, and then I used a random generator on the internet to pick the winners. So the winners are Sergio Antonio and Felicia Prince. So you guys, I'll be in touch with you for your Amazon gift cards. And thank you all for supporting. So I see there's a couple people who have joined. I think hopefully you guys will be able to leave comments as we're kind of talking, especially if you have any questions. But I think you have to go to StreamYard and give permission. So hopefully you guys, but if you're in here and you're live, say hello. So last week we started talking about trauma, and I talked about the biology of trauma and what trauma is. And a lot of times, I talked about how we see trauma as an event, right? Like something that happens to you, like when war veterans go off to war and they come back and they have PTSD, right? And I kind of countered that with, if trauma is truly an event, then everybody who fights in a war would come back with PTSD. And that's actually just not true. Because we're all different people, and our makeup and our DNA and our brains are all very different. Two people can go through the exact same thing and experience it in two totally different ways, deal with it in two totally different ways. So it's not necessarily the event that's the trauma, but something about an event has dysregulated your central nervous system. And because again, it's different for everybody. How I'm impacted by something is different from how somebody else may be impacted by it. Somebody could have like true PTSD symptoms like nightmares and flashbacks, and that might not happen for me, even though we went through the same thing. So it's a traumatic, trauma is really something personal for you, and how it affects you and how you deal with it, how you cope with it. But essentially, it is it's dysregulation of your central nervous system. So your brain is kind of affected, and your life and how you experience new events can be colored or affected by how you experience trauma. So that's kind of what we talked about last week. I gave y'all a little biology lesson about parts of the brain and how that is all impacted. So if you want to know more about that, go back and watch the video from last week. But this week we are going to keep it moving, and I want to tell you guys about one of the most important studies in trauma that you probably have never heard of, because why would you? But I think it's interesting, and actually kind of shed some light for me. but also like, what does this study mean for you? Like, what are the implications for you? Like what does this mean for you? That's the important part, right? Like, how does it affect you? So this study, right? The year was 1985. And he probably was around time Purple Rain came out. I don't know. I was 3. But I love Purple Rain. Maybe it came out in 1986. Anyway, the year was 1985. You have Dr. Feletti, I believe was his name. And he is a physician. He's a doctor for Kaiser Permanente. And so they were doing a study on obesity, actually. And he was just like mystified. He was like dumbstruck because he couldn't figure out why people were just dropping out of the study. Like, they would lose weight, but then they would drop out, and then he realized that they would like gain the weight back, and he was just like, my study is not successful. What is going on? And don't they like discover everything by accident? Like, Viagra is supposed to be for your heart, and then they found out. I digress. So this is an obesity study, right? And so, half of the people are dropping out. So he's like, my study is not, it's been 5 years. My study is not successful. What is going on? And so what he realized is that all of the dropouts had been born at a normal weight, like they weren't overweight babies. And also what he found was that they didn't gain weight slowly over the years. Like, he was thinking that, like you would gain 10 pounds every year until like, you were like overweight. But that wasn't necessarily the case. Like, they, when they gained weight, it was really abrupt, and then it stabilized. And if they lost weight, then they regained it pretty much in a short time. So he starts to ask these questions because he's trying to figure out, what's going on, what's happening. So he asks these questions, and he's asking these questions like, well, how much did you weigh when you were born? How much did you weigh when you started first grade? How much did you weigh when you entered high school? How old, how the question was supposed to be like, how old were you when you became sexually active? How old were you when you were married? He made a mistake, like I almost just did just now. And so because all the questions started with, how much did you weigh when? How much did you weigh when? And so one of the questions was supposed to be, how old were you when you became sexually active? One of the researchers made a mistake and said, how much did you weigh when you first became sexually active? And one of the patients said, I weighed 40 pounds, right? So if you're thinking 40 pounds, that's how much a child weighs, right? That's not, a healthy adult weight. So 40 pounds, that's weird. So they knew something was kind of off right then. And so she goes into this story about how she was like 4 years old when, she was sexually molested. And so they dig deeper into this. And what they found is that of almost 300 people that they interviewed, most of them had been sexually abused as children. And these are all the people in this weight study, right? And so he was like, oh, like, what does this mean? So they seek to, find out what this means. So then in 1995, right, 1995, I'm in 7th grade now. I'm 12 years old. I still don't know anything about the study because why would I? They continue, asking these questions. And they actually expand now to ask these broader questions, right? Because they really are trying to figure out. And they find out 3 kind of shocking things, right? And the first shocking thing is that there's a direct link between childhood trauma and the onset of adult chronic disease, as well as mental illness, time in prison, work issues, and absenteeism. So that's the first shocker, that childhood trauma, there's a direct link between childhood trauma and chronic disease, mental illness, time in prison, work issues, like problems on your job, and like, like not showing up to work. So that's shocker number 1. They like, what? But like, what does this mean? The second shocker is 2/3, 66% of the people in this study had 1 or more types of trauma. Okay. And then again, the third shocker, which is just like the first shocker, is that what they call these adverse childhood experiences resulted in higher risk of medical, mental, and social problems as an adult. Right. So when they expanded these questions, they called them the adverse childhood experiences. Right. And when you just think about this, or ACEs, right? We call it ACEs for short. And the ACEs pretty much divides childhood trauma into 3 categories. Okay. So the first category is household dysfunction, which is substance abuse, parents that, or guardians that dealt with substance abuse, parental separation or divorce, parent or guardian mental illness, a parent experiencing domestic violence, and then a parent like in prison or having something to do with criminal behavior. The second category was abuse, whether it's psychological, physical, or sexual. And then the third category was neglect, either emotional or physical, right? So you have like these 10 kind of things. And each one gives you 1 point. And the more points you get, the more likely you are, right, to deal with chronic disease, like heart disease, hepatitis, pulmonary disease, STDs. The more likely you are to have difficulties with mental health. So alcoholism, drug addiction, anxiety, depression, all kind of stuff. So they found this link between childhood trauma and these problems as an adult, right? And so what does this mean? What does this mean for us? Right, is the question. And so when I was like learning about this study, like my mind was blown. And the first thing I wanted to figure out was, well, what's my ACEs score, right? Like how many do I have? Right. And you can, figure out how many you have too. But I was at like, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7. And so they say that things start getting real serious once you have a score 4 or higher. Like literally a score 4 or higher puts you at a 240% greater risk of like hepatitis, which is, I don't have hepatitis, but I'm just saying. So the higher your ACEs score, the more likely you are to have issues as an adult, whether physical, like your physical body, your mental health, and your emotional health as well, your social health. And so that was it's a big deal because they didn't know this. And the other big deal about this study was that this was middle-class white people. This wasn't even like people of color. This was middle-class white people who had health insurance. They were dealing with this. 66% of the people had one or more types of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And so they pretty much were like, this is like a pandemic. We need to do something about this, and we know people of color deal with things all the time. So I guess, I don't know if they just assume like it must be rough for them too as well. So this study is super important, and people use it all the time to kind of talk about this and talk about the effects of childhood trauma. Like it's not something that happens one time, but it can impact your life. Now, here's good news, right? Because once I learned about the study, I was like, well, I'm not just going to resign myself to getting COPD or having heart disease just because I have a score of 6, which is pretty high. And if you have my book, then you know what some of my experiences are. And so same for you, right? Like if you are like, man, my mom experienced domestic violence, or I had a parent in jail, or I had a parent who dealt with mental illness, or I was sexually abused or emotionally neglected. I have a high ACEs score too. What does that mean for me? I know what the study says, but there's also things to counteract that, right? And that's really what we want to get into next week. I don't like to spend a whole lot of time talking because I don't like watching long videos. And I feel like I'm right around my 15-minute mark. But there's a resilience scale as well. And so this thing can be counteracted, right? Like if you believe that your parents loved you, if you had one person that you felt cared about you, or your neighbors or your friends liked you, or you had teachers or coaches who helped you, or you thought that someone in your family cared about you, or you could find somebody that you could trust to talk to, right? Like those are, build up your resiliency score, which can help to counteract that high ACEs score. And then I also feel like knowledge is the most important thing. Like knowing something like this gives me a reason to act, right? Like, so doing the things that you need to do to heal is the most important thing, whether that's going to therapy, right? And really figuring out ways to cope and to deal and to heal. If that's going to church and seeking God, like those are the two things that help me. First God, then therapy. But or whatever it may be, mindfulness, being a good parent, right? Like I know my childhood experiences motivate me to be the best parent I can be. And that's why I put my energy into too. It's important for me to heal so that I can be a good mom, right? And be a good friend and a good wife and all that good stuff. So the study didn't make me sad. It just shed light, like, well, this makes sense. Childhood trauma can have a big impact, but that doesn't have to be the end of the story. Is the good news is that, there's resilience. If there's just one person that you felt cared about you, or somebody that you could talk to, or even just being, strong and wanting to get out and do better, telling your story, like I said, God, therapy, whatever it is, you can beat that score is really the deal. So that is the ACEs. They call it the ACEs study. It didn't start off as the ACEs trauma study. It started off as an obesity study, but here we are. So that's that study. And like I said, it's one of the most important studies that you've probably never heard of, and kind of its implications, what that might mean for you. But like I said, most importantly, it's not the end of the story. We can be resilient, and it's important to heal. That's the most important thing. So in the next week or two, we'll go more into depth on ways you can heal. Maybe drop your questions below if there's anything you want me to answer for next week too. If you have any questions about trauma, what are your thoughts about that ACEs score? Do you know your ACEs score? How many points would you get? When you think about that, right? Like I said, if you dealt with a parent with substance abuse, or you dealt with divorced parents or separation, or a parent with mental illness, or a battered mother, or criminal behavior, if you were abused psychologically, physically, sexually, or neglected emotionally or physically, each one of those counts for a point, right? But don't stop there. What's your resilience score? How resilient are you? Who loved you? How did you cope? Who could you talk to? Who could you turn to? How are you healing and dealing right now? That's the healing is the most important part. So drop your questions and we'll talk about it some more next week. Good night.